Good morning. My name is Dave Cohn. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs here at the Union League Club of Chicago. And on behalf of the officers, directors, and members of the club, it's my privilege to welcome you to this morning's forum on Illinois' fiscal morass that we are presenting in partnership with our friends at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and Ralph Matire, who in a moment, if you are feeling good this morning, don't worry, Ralph will take care of that momentarily. We all watched the State of the Union last night. President Obama sounded some notes of optimism. I think that all Illinoisans feel a sense of optimism or hope as we enter a new legislative session, a new General Assembly, a new governor, and renewed hope that we will be able to come together as the people of Illinois and our elected representatives and solve the daunting fiscal and budgetary challenges that confront us. To get underway, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, our good colleague, the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, and the most optimistic man I know, Ralph Matire. Ralph? There he is.
I have often accused of not having nearly enough sunshine in my presentations. All this dour focus on tax policy, et cetera. So I thought today I would start off with a burst of sunshine, some happiness, and now let's get to Illinois. Our problems in the state are very much fiscally focused in our general fund. And what I thought I would do to start the program off is to break down what's really been covered in the general fund over the last few years, and historically, because you have to understand what a fund pays for to get why it's important that we ensure it has the capacity to do what it's supposed to do. So our general fund is roughly $35 billion. It's got two big parts, hard costs and current service expenditures, right? Those are the two big parts. The hard costs, there's really no discretion over legislatively or in the governor's office. These are things the state has to pay by law. It's primarily three things: debt service, the pension contribution, and something called statutory transfers out. These literally are statutes that say you must take X dollars and transfer it out of the general fund to. The two big things that get transfers here are Medicaid and the local government distributive fund, which is where the state shares some of its income tax revenue with local governments. That's usually the vast majority of the statutory transfers out. Then there's the current service expenditures. It's about $24 billion of the $35 billion fund. And you could see 9 out of $10 go to healthcare, education, human services, and public safety. That's the majority of our budget. Now, I say discretion varies because many times the state just doesn't have the legal authority to simply cut in a few of these line items. So, for instance, in social services, you can't overburden certain caseworkers, et cetera, by cutting spending there. Public safety, you can't overcut in your correctionals because you have to have a certain number of workers. Healthcare, the vast majority of this is Medicaid. And Medicaid is a joint state-federal program. And to implement cuts in Medicaid, you do need federal approval on a number of things. Illinois recently just passed something called the SMART Act, where they implemented or attempted to implement a number of cuts to the Medicaid program, a good portion of which were denied by the federal government. So the discretion isn't absolute here, but that's where 9 out of $10 go. Two other big factors get paid for under the general fund. Group health. That's the health insurance for state workers, both current and retired. That's 5% of the budget, and it's been a growing budget figure over time. Why is that? It's because the state historically hasn't budgeted accurately for its group health costs. And Senate President Cullerton said, no, we need to be more transparent here. So over the last few years, you've seen a ramp up in this line in the budget. That's not actually the state incurring new liability. That's just simply it being more transparent on what this actual liability is. Everything else, administration, economic development, ag, environmental protection, that's just 4% of the budget. So this is pretty much how our money gets spent and gets spent historically over time. Now let's put some meat on the bones. Here is the 2015 budget that we're currently living under. You can see $35.6 billion in total spending. We have about $35.3 billion in revenue for this year. So right there, there's a mismatch between our revenue and our spending of about $300 million. Our hard costs this year are $10.7 billion, but that's understated by $600 million. Why? When the temporary tax increase began phasing down on January 1st of this year, that was literally halfway through this fiscal year. So it had a revenue impact on 2015 that legislators and the governor knew about when they put this budget together. So they tried to engage in a number of, let's say, budgetary maneuvers to deal with the decline in revenue year to year between last year and 2015. And that decline of revenue is substantial, about $2 billion. One of the ways it was covered was they prepaid $600 million of the hard costs that were actually due in 2015 last year in 2014 with 2014 revenue. And the prepayment was on Medicaid expenditures. So not only did they make it look as if there's a lower hard cost total for this year, but that generated $300 million in match. So it got another $300 million into the state's coffers. There are a couple of other gimmicks that were used to get through this fiscal year and to cover over that loss of revenue. But I just thought I would highlight this one at the top. Then you see the $25 billion in general fund service appropes, and you can see how they go: early childhood, K-12, healthcare, higher ed, et cetera, straight down. Here's your group health and everything else the state does. My favorite line in any budget is the unspent appropriations line, $330 million. That just means whatever these budgeted figures are, some of that is not going to get spent. And those decisions will be made over the course of the year. The amount that they will not spend is $330 million out of what was appropriated, which means net spending on services, $24.9 billion. Now, I told you they had $35.3 billion roughly in revenue this year. So it looks like it's close to a balanced budget, but there's one line missing, and that's the carry forward deficit from 2014, $6.5 billion. By law, all those bills will have to be paid before the expiration of this fiscal year out of this fiscal year's revenue. So that means that's another $6.5 billion cost line you have to put in here, which reduces revenue by that amount, plus the overspending by $300 million, meaning our deficit that will carry forward from 2015 into 2016 becomes $6.8 billion. There's been a lot of concern that the state's fiscal problems have been driven by a ramp up in spending, particularly since we did pass that temporary tax increase a few years back. But the data simply don't support that. This is general fund spending on services, so I took out the hard costs. This is just service expenditures, nominal dollars not adjusted for inflation since 2009. So the temporary tax increase happens here, and you say, well, wait a minute, there was a little increase in spending here, right? Wasn't that funded by the temporary tax increase? Isn't that what they did? Sorry, it just died. And the answer is not really. Two things are going on here. Remember that SMART Act I talked about where the state attempted to cut Medicaid expenditures by a certain amount and had the federal government deny some of those cuts? That's a good portion of this increase in spending. The budget assumed those cuts would become lawful, and they weren't. So although the budgeted amounts went down in these 2 years expecting to save some money, those savings weren't realized due to the federal denial, hence a bump up. The other bump up is Senate President Cullerton's decision to more honestly reflect the actual cost of group health. That's it. That's the entire growth from here to here. So there really hasn't been an increase, even in nominal dollars, in expenditures on those four core services. There has been a decrease. Then we looked at the long term on spending to see if, in real terms, after inflation, spending was in fact driving some of our deficit problems in Illinois. And again, the answer is very clearly no. The first bar compares 2015 appropriations for services to 2000 with no adjustment for inflation. And in nominal dollars, it does look like we're spending about 19% more. The middle bar adjusts those 2015 expenditures for services for inflation, using the consumer price index. The second you adjust for inflation and population changes, in real terms, state spending on those 4 core services has been cut by 23% over that sequence. Now that uses the consumer price index, which is a really good inflation metric for the economy as a whole, but not so much for public sector spending. And why is that? Well, what the public sector spends on is mostly labor. The consumer price index includes things like Pop-Tarts and hair care products, et cetera. State government's not buying a lot of Pop-Tarts, or at least since Blagojevich has been gone, hair care products. But what state government buys is labor. So the employment cost index, a more accurate inflation metric for the cost of labor over time, when that's applied to state expenditures, it's clear that we're spending significantly less on these core services, almost 30% less. We can buy 30% less in labor with what we're spending today. I just wanted to let you see that it's been an across-the-board cut. So come here to the percentage. This is using the employment cost index. Healthcare, pre-K through 12 education, higher ed, social services, public safety, everything else, all cut across the board in real terms since 2000. So I don't care what you're an advocate of, there's been a cut. Now, we do have a new governor in Springfield. And our new governor, both as a candidate for office and in his inaugural address, made it clear he intends to spend more on education broadly across the board than the state currently does. So those of you who are advocates of education are hopeful that these couple of lines here will turn around and go up under the new administration. But this event is about facing facts. And the governor is going to have a pretty significant challenge living up to this commitment to invest more in public education, given what's going to happen to the revenue side of our ledger and our hard costs. So one more thing on spending, because a lot of political discussion tries to say, look, we need to cut more because Illinois is a high-spending state to begin with. And the data just don't confirm that, no matter what data sets you look at. Illinois is the 5th largest population and the 5th largest economy of any state in the nation. But that said, our spending compared to other states, pick your metric, 28th or 36th in the nation on those services. And in fact, we rank 49th out of the 50 states in number of state workers per capita. We have consistently been a low-spending state. We are cutting our spending on services, and all the data indicate that. Now for those hard costs. This is the growth in those hard costs the state has no discretion to cut over the last few years. You can see since '04, so about the last 10-year period, the hard costs have jumped from just over $3 billion, $3.5 billion, to $12 billion anticipated for 2016. In case you're wondering how that compares to inflation, it's 130% greater. Now, what's driving this growth in hard cost? And it's this big line. This is the pension payment. You'll notice that statutory transfers out, which is the red, have grown a little bit. That includes primarily, like I said, Medicaid, local government distributive fund. And debt service, we didn't really have much before in the general fund, but now we have about $2.2 billion. That's grown some. But this is the big growth. But I want to be very clear, that growth is also debt service. It is not pension contribution cost from a normal cost standpoint. In fact, over this sequence, the normal cost to the state as an employer, i.e. the cost of the benefits to be funded, has varied between about $1.1 and $1.5 billion a year. The total payment's over $6 billion. All of that $5 billion excess is debt service. It's our repayment of debt owed to the pension system that for decades, both parties decided it was the right thing to do was to borrow against the pension instead of putting in the full contribution and use that borrowed revenue to support current services. Now we've got a repayment plan that is creating tremendous pressure on the state. And to be very clear, this is an artificial repayment plan that's a creature of statute. We do not owe this money to a bank. We owe it to the pension system, and the repayment of it is set by law. And you can see the ramp up by law. That's what's crushing the state. That is, in fact, this growth in hard costs is why the state budget incrementally gets a little larger from year to year. It's got nothing to do with investing in current services. It's got everything to do with repaying past debts, particularly to the pension system. So what was the impact of that temporary tax increase? How was that revenue used, and what did it mean for the state? Well, here we're looking at the impact in revenue from fiscal years 2011 through 2014 when we had it. This is the state's accumulated deficit, including the revenue from the temporary tax increase. The red bar is what the accumulated deficit would be in the general fund if we didn't have that revenue, but every other act taken by the General Assembly over the last few years is held constant, i.e., that significant cut in spending on services. This includes over $3 billion in cuts to services in nominal dollars. Despite those cuts, you would have had tremendous growth in the deficit driven by these hard costs. Okay, that's the pressure that would have resulted in these deficits, and they're amazing. 2014, it would have been $31 billion. The entire general fund, including hard costs, is 35. So where did the money get spent? Well, here's the revenue from the tax increase. Here's an additional $800 million generated over the sequence by cuts in revenue. So they freed up revenue to fund other things by cutting spending on some things. And here's how we could see that money was spent. $5 billion of it went to covering past due bills and reducing our accumulated deficit, which going into 2011 was approaching $15 billion. So a lot of it was used to pay past due bills. The rest of it was used to pay the growth in those hard costs, and not even enough to cover all of it, which is why our deficit is growing a little. So when you really break it down to numbers, there's not much ideologically happening at the state budget. It's all math. Our bills are going up for the debts we've incurred over years, and we don't really have the revenue to cover them. This is what the fiscal cliff looks like, as how much recurring revenue will decline under current law, the phase down of the temporary tax increase. You can see in 2014, the state had $36.7 billion in recurring revenue. That dropped to $34 billion. In 2015, it will drop to $31 billion. So looking over a 2-year sequence, that's a $5 billion drop in revenue, and our hard costs are going up. That's a pretty difficult fiscal condition if you care about public services. So let's just look quickly at the 2014-15 enacted and 16 projected budget. And the projected budget is based on COGFA numbers, et cetera, except for this one, so I'll get to that in a second. You can see the top line is recurring revenue. You can see that $5 billion decline in recurring revenue. 2015, we have a magic $650 million in one-time revenue. This was borrowing that the state did from other special funds, which has to be repaid, by the way, next year. But they did borrow that money from special funds, so that created another $650 million in revenue. Debt proceeds can be counted as revenue in public budgeting, bringing our total revenue up to that $35.3 billion figure I quoted before. Here's our net spending on services. Here's our hard costs out of that net spending. Here's the accumulated deficit carry forward. Here's the growth from 6.5 to 6.8 billion going into 2016. Here's the drop in revenue. We don't have that one-time borrowing revenue, so it is just $31.7 billion in revenue. If net spending on services is just held constant, I'm not talking an increase for education or anything else, it's just held constant, then there's another $12 billion in hard costs. We have to repay the one-time revenue we borrowed last year. That's another $650 million cost item. We have a deficit carry forward from the prior year of $6.8 billion, meaning our deficit just jumped to $12.7 billion, or 50% of what we spend on services. That's probably not a sustainable fiscal position. I will point out one more thing just to try to make these numbers real. That $5 billion decline in revenue is more than the state will spend on all social and human services in 2015, $4.8 billion. The decline in revenue is greater than all spending for social services. It's significant. All right. So here's just a walk down to that deficit again, looking forward to the next year. And here's looking forward a little longer. Everything that I gave you from a data standpoint so far is straight out of COGFA or the Office of Management and the Budget. None of these are CTBA numbers. These are straight out of publicly available documents. This is the first sort of modeling that we've done, and we like to avoid doing modeling because very much your outcomes depend on your assumptions and you could jury-rig your outcomes. So I want you to know that our model for depicting whether or not the state actually has a structural imbalance between revenue and service cost growth over time has been peer-reviewed. It's been peer-reviewed by the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, guys over there like David Merriman and Fred Gertz, and the head of state and local tax for the GAO in Washington, D.C. So it's a pretty solid model. And in fact, we've used it in the past, and it's been within 1 to 3% of the state's actual deficit. And the differential is usually changes in law. We can't project for changes in law. So this assumes no changes in law, just do tomorrow what you do today. You adjust for historic rates of inflation and historic rates of population growth. You assume a normal economy. Based on that, the red bar shows you what our current law is projected to do on revenue. That is our revenue situation. Now this is kind of strange. This weirdly colored bar, the differential is better before the colors went nuts. This weirdly colored bar is current law on services adjusted for inflation and population growth, and current law on repayment of the debt owed to the pension system. So the gap between the growth in service costs and debt service over time and revenue is the structural imbalance. And you can see that revenue certainly will not maintain our ability to pay the debts we owe and fund the current level of services we provide. Going out on a limb, we think it's highly likely that current law on repayment of the pension system will remain unconstitutional. We've said all along that that act was unconstitutional. The blue bar puts back in the old pension funding system that existed prior to the pension reform bill that was just ruled unconstitutional and has a stay put on it anyway. So this is really a more accurate depiction of our cost line. This bar says, all right, what happens if you make those temporary tax increases permanent? Well, it helps. Obviously, the revenue doesn't dip, and you have less of a growth in your structural imbalance over time. But the other thing this shows, and I think very clearly, is that the rate of growth in revenue is much flatter than the rate of growth in the cost of maintaining service levels and paying our debt. And the reason for that is our tax policy is just not designed to work in a modern economy. So our taxes do not grow with the economy, but at a minimum, adjusting for inflation and population changes, the cost of providing services does. And that mismatch really can't be solved in any sustainable way with spending cuts. Let's just assume, pick your revenue line, I don't care which one you pick. In 2022, whoever is governor says, all right, I'm going to cut spending right down to revenue. Well, that's great. You've probably eviscerated K-12 education and higher ed and social services, but you've balanced the budget. But here's your problem. The very next year, the slope, the rate of growth in your service cost will be greater than the rate of growth in your revenue, and the very next year you'll have a deficit again. So what we've been saying all along is this problem can't be solved unless two things happen. Thing number one, the state needs to modernize its tax code. And yes, that means by adding more revenue, but doing it the way tax policy should be done if you picked up a textbook on tax policy. The second thing is that crushing debt repayment schedule that we have to the pension systems has to be thrown out. And we need to re-amortize that debt to a level dollar amount, one that doesn't grow from year to year, but remains constant, remains one that the state can afford. In fact, we've modeled this out. If you got to a debt repayment line of about $7.2 billion, that would allow the state to grow its funded ratio in its pension systems to the point where in 30 years we'd be about 80% funded, which is healthy under the CBO, and in about 43 years we'd be 100% funded. Takes a little longer than current law, but I don't think current law is sustainable. But number two, it allows you to get that higher funded ratio while meeting all cash flow obligations of the pension system to both current and future retirees. And this just requires a change in law. Now, if we did these two things, you could eliminate that structural imbalance and actually generate some revenue to, fund Governor Rauner's commitment to invest more in education comprehensively across the board, and maybe restore some of the significant cuts that have been implemented, especially to social services, over the last 15 years or so. Now, we do know that there's a lot of concern that if, in fact, tax increases are part of the solution, that you're going to harm your economy. And the data just don't support that. And I want to be very clear on the arguments I am and am not about to make. I am not claiming one can tax oneself to prosperity. I would never make that claim, and there are no data to support it. On the other hand, you cannot cut your way to prosperity, and tax policy, at least from a statistically meaningful standpoint, has absolutely no correlation to economic growth over time. Here's one example. There are 41 states in America that have an income tax. 9 do not. Of the 9 states that do not have an income tax, you have a couple of the economic miracle states. You have Texas and North Dakota, right, Florida, states people always point to as having growing, prosperous economies. This just compares economic growth on 3 major indexes between those 9 states in America that have no income tax at all and the 9 states in America that not only have an income tax but have the highest rates, the highest taxing income tax states. So the high tax states are the blue bars, and the red bars, well, they used to be red, the red bars are the no tax states. Average unemployment rate over the last decade, little higher in the high tax states than in the no tax state, but statistically a meaningless differential. Change in real median income. Well, we did have the Great Recession. Median income went down in both areas, slightly less in the high tax states than in the no tax states, but once again, statistically not a meaningful difference. Growth in per capita real estate GSP, actually here there's a statistically meaningful differential. The high tax states did a little bit better than the no tax states. But do you see a statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your economy? And the answer is no. And every peer-reviewed study on this subject comes to the same conclusion, including those done by more conservative worldview groups like the Cato Institute, the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship. They have both come to the same conclusion. There's one more data point on that. This is what's happened to the national economy after certain changes in tax policy at the federal level. Because taxes at the federal level are far more meaningful than state taxes. Here you see the increase passed by Bush Sr. in 1990, and look what happened to the economy. It grew. 1993, you have the Clinton tax increase. The economy not only grew, it went to a peak. And then the dot-com boom blew up, and all those dot-com companies went out of business. So we went into a relatively mild recession going into the George W. Bush first term. So he cut taxes. Nothing happened. He accelerated his tax cut. The economy tanked. Notice this only goes through 2006, so this doesn't include the Great Recession. No correlation between tax policy and what's happening economically. Other things matter more. So when it comes to tax policy, CTBA's position and what the data suggest are get it right. Get it right so your state has the capacity to pay its bills and to make adequate investments in core services that are driven by your demographically identified needs. That's what matters. And on all those happy notes, Senator Harmon and Senator Murphy, who are gracious enough to join us today, I do want to thank the Union League for hosting this event. They've been a fantastic partner.
You're on.
I'm on? Okay, great. So now I think we're going to turn it over to our two elected officials to give their initial response and some visions for how to handle these problems, which are very difficult and meaningful problems. I think Senator Murphy, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. It's nice to see a good full house for a hearty conversation about the state of affairs in Illinois. There are things that I would quarrel with a little bit in the presentation. I think we have a little bit more latitude and discretion over spending than perhaps the perception was, but I think the important thing is the general premise of there being a substantial hole and a significant problem is one that is shared, I think, by everybody up here. And that the fact that it warrants a different course and a different approach, I think, is also shared by everybody up here. And I think the other thing that is shared by everybody up here is the goal of being a fiscally sound state where opportunity for the people who live here to succeed is far better than it is today or has been. And, you know, where we sometimes don't agree are the means to that shared end. And we'll probably continue to have some disagreements about that along the way. But I also think something for you to take away from our presentation here today is the belief that, or the hope that having a new governor, a Republican governor with a Democratic legislature, and the shared governance that comes with that, and the back and forth of different views that comes with that, I think provides a unique opportunity for those of us in Illinois government to hit the reset button, if I can borrow that from Secretary Clinton, and in the spirit of bipartisanship. And you know, Governor Rauner ran effectively as a change agent. He was sent down there. The phrase that you know, has been used ad nauseum is to shake up Springfield. You know, I think from a practical standpoint, what that means is go down there and question absolutely everything that's going on and has gone on. Push back on everything and go with a view of what can be changed, what can we do differently. And the nice thing is he goes down with the credibility of an outsider and a change agent. And to the extent that he sees things from the conventional wisdom that he does have to accept, I think that gives more credibility to the rest of the state to recognize these are difficult, intractable problems. There is no easier way out of them. And I think that might make it a little bit easier to bridge the gap. The flip side of that, of course, is that my friends on the other side of the aisle have to come to grips with the notion that they do not have total control of state government anymore. And the solutions that they believe deeply are best to get us out of this aren't necessarily always shared by that Republican governor or we Republican legislators, and that there's going to need to be some give and take. But I do think this point in time and this change of players gives us a chance to maybe strike a grand bargain. And the big challenges are, as I see it, this. Number one, you have the roof on fire in the here and now from a budget standpoint. And the governor and the legislature have to deal with that. You have to deal with the here and now. The other problem is that This state, frankly, has lagged from an opportunity standpoint for too long. There are all sorts of depressing numbers about job numbers and where we rank and our bond rating and out-migration. We've got all of these numbers we can tick off that suggest the problem, and I think everybody involved in this process wants us to get better in those rankings. We're proud of Illinois. We think there's a lot worth fighting for in Illinois, and those rankings are a stain on everybody who's involved. So we've got this opportunity together to maybe say, all right, we got to deal with the short term, but don't take your eye off the long-term growth opportunities. Do what you can to solve this short-term problem, but don't take your eye off of the effect of our becoming a state that instead of being in the bottom 5 for job growth is in the top 5 for job growth. That's who we want to be, because these economic numbers, they get a lot easier when we have way more taxpayers making way more money, whatever the rate is, right? So do what you need to do in the short run, but as part of this grand bargain, look at ways to make Illinois a more economically viable place for job growth to occur, so we can take advantage of the tremendous inherent advantages Illinois has, separate and apart from wonderful legislators like Don and I. We have way more going for us than any state in the Midwest, maybe the country. We don't have the oil resources per se that Texas and North Dakota have. We're going to find out pretty soon what it looks like to be too reliant on one source of revenue anyway, I think, with oil prices where they are. But we have the ability to be a stable, diverse, but growing economy. And if we get policy right here in the near term, and we have an opportunity to market those things that make us unique and great, while bridging out of what has been seemingly a perpetual economic crisis mode, this has the chance to be a heck of a turnaround story. I think everybody's going to have to go down at this with an open mind. When the new governor is challenging the status quo, I hope he can do it in a way that doesn't poison the well in terms of the tenor and tone with the people he's got to work with. But I also hope those of us who have been down there recognize that he's doing his job, and it isn't personal. And we really do need to look at the way we operate, what we've done, and reconsider absolutely everything. Doesn't mean that we're going to, throw magic beans all over these issues and make them all go away. There are difficult choices coming. You can have, we should restructure the way we do our tax policy. I think that's a conversation everybody has to be open to. I just want to make sure people don't lose sight of the fact that while we have difficult challenges ahead, we have tough decisions ahead, we have more here worth fighting for than we're the envy of a lot of states in terms of our natural assets. And it's not too late for a great turnaround in Illinois. And I think if everybody in Springfield will embrace that, maybe leave behind some of your old prejudices or policy biases, maybe we've got an opportunity to do something this spring that's truly transformational for Illinois.
Well, I could not be happier to share the stage with Senator Murphy. He's a good friend and a good legislator, and I don't know if he knows this or if he's admitted it to himself, but he's the chief sponsor of the next state budget and a chief co-sponsor of the Rauner tax increase. So. But I hope we don't disappoint,
Then I'm
because
going to have to move to Oak Park, though, because they won't let me back in Palatine.
I hope we won't disappoint, because actually we do have a lot more in common than I think folks would think as we look at this. We are in an era of shared governance, and that's of critical importance, and it will allow us to do incredibly difficult things that we could not do with total control held by the Democratic Party. We have to work together. We have to seek compromise. And we all want the same thing. We want the state to succeed. We want the governor to succeed. We want the legislature to succeed because we want the state to succeed. We will have differences on policy, without a doubt. I think that there are clear policy differences that will get better or worse along the way. On tax policy, I do think there's an opportunity for a grander bargain. I remain completely committed to amending the Constitution to permit a fair tax so that we can apply lower tax rates to lower income levels and higher tax rates to higher income levels. They are from Oak Park, Matt, I told you so. But the fact is, we have a constitutional blunt instrument for tax policy. It does not allow us to be nimble. It does not allow us to target tax relief to middle-class families. It doesn't allow us to be surgical in how we do tax policy. I am eagerly awaiting the governor's budget address because I don't know what he plans to do. I know the challenge is great. Here's the thing, the challenges that were presented today are no secret. The Senate Democrats put most of this on our website when we passed the budget in June. There were, I don't like the term gimmicks because we weren't hiding anything. This is how we balance a budget in a year when a temporary income tax is set to expire in the middle of the fiscal year. This was a prelude to a public debate in the gubernatorial election on tax policy. We positioned ourselves, if Governor Quinn won re-election, to come back, to extend the temporary tax rates permanently, and to continue to stem the bleeding. It doesn't get us out of the tunnel, but it continues to stem the bleeding. Now we are in a very different world, where that tax increase has expired, where we are facing these real deficits, and we do have a new governor and an opportunity as a legislature to engage and to figure out a way out of this mess. It won't be easy. I do think we were on a much better trajectory for the last 4 fiscal years. We fully funded our pension obligations. We chipped away at that backlog of bills from a high of about $9.2 billion to a low of $3.8 billion. And unpaid bills, I mean, if anyone has a visa and you've gotten your bill and you haven't mailed your check in, by our definition, you are a delinquent. You have an unpaid bill. Most of the unpaid bills are 30 to 60 days past due right now, so it's not as calamitous as it appears. But we've chipped away at that. There is no doubt that the expiration of the temporary income tax rates has reversed much of that progress, and we can't sit idly by and assume it will get better. We can't tax our way out of it. We can't cut our way out of it. We can't grow our way out of it. It's a combination of the three. But I am looking forward to that. I've worked through all of my stages of grief following the governor's election. And I'm now trying to embrace the real opportunities. I've said this before. There were things we were able to do with a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature that we will not be able to do in an era of shared governance. But the reverse is very much true as well. There are things we simply could not do with Democratic control of both branches of government that we will now be able to tackle honestly and earnestly. And I join Matt in saying we need to check many of our partisan instincts at the door. We won't be able to check all of them. We've learned from you how much fun it looks like to be on the other side throwing rocks. So you might have to wear a helmet a little bit.
I might have lobbed a pebble or two. Throwing rocks, it doesn't sound like me.
I'm building a book of Matt Murphy quotes from the floor. You might hear a few of them come back at you during the debates this session.
Were those recorded?
But I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Ralph, thanks very much for having us.
No, I really want to thank both of these individuals for coming here today, because I have to tell you, it's brave politically to come in front of this audience, deal with these numbers when you have a brand new governor and you have no idea what the governor is going to do on his budget address. So I think we need to give a little round of applause to both of these elected officials.
Hear, hear.
And of course, CTBA agrees that bipartisan cooperation is the best way to produce public policy, as long as you're willing to be data-based. really left-wing, right-wing's irrelevant. If an initiative comports with the data and best practices, it should be supported. And over time, Illinois has had some bipartisan cooperation, especially when there's been split governance. So David, I think, is going to go get some questions.
Right,
from
we're
the
going to
audience.
have, it's audience Q&A time, and I'll walk around if you raise your hand, you have a question for the legislators or for Ralph. But if I could, I'd like to just take a point of personal privilege to ask Ralph one quick question before we get to asking our senators to take some questions from the audience. During your presentation, you asserted with some graphs and some data that there really is no significant correlation between tax policy and economic performance, so to speak, correct?
That's correct.
But you're not really asserting that tax policy has no effect whatsoever on economic behavior, because it's a well-known economic principle. If you want to depress an activity, you tax the living you-know-what out of it.
No,
So, all taxes are not the same. There are consumption taxes.
No, David, so what it is whether or not your tax policy actually has a statistically meaningful correlation to what happens economically at your state level. And the answer there is no. The Congressional Budget Office did a major study on this, the nonpartisan CBO. They came up with that conclusion. Certainly the Small Business Administration did a similar study, the Cato Institute, and even the Lincoln Land Policy Institute found that while certain tax incentives, particularly on property taxes, et cetera, could have a regional impact on promoting maybe economic growth here versus there, that even those impacts are greatly outweighed by other factors. So really, while certainly there will be some micro behavioral impacts from tax policy changes, and there always are, what you're looking for is whether or not those changes actually have a statistically meaningful correlation to your economy over time. And the answer to that is no.
Okay. Well,
David,
let's...
further, before we go further,
Please, Senator.
I don't share that belief.
Really?
That Ralph laid out there. I mean, there are statistics.
I'm shocked.
There are statistics out there. You know, everybody's got it. Everybody's got statistics. Fundamentally, it just defies human nature to say that tax policy has no impact. We can and have, I think, you can overstate, and I think in this case, understate the impact. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I mean, we saw the largest spike in unemployment of any state in the country after the tax increase here in 2011, and these guys laid out, I think, pretty accurately where that money went. It really did go to make the pension payments, and there's value in that, and I can appreciate that. But I think, and this was kind of my point when I was talking about how we deal with the crisis we have now while keeping an eye on being as pro-growth as we can be to transform what we are and have been as a state. We can't lose sight of the fact that tax policy, or how much debt we have, where we're spending, how much we're spending, that these things actually do have an impact on what we look like down the road. So, I mean, that's going to be part of the tug back and forth is, how do you thread that needle? And I think part of the reason that I think the shared governance model will work is I think, both of us are going to have a little more say in it, and I think also you're going to kind of pull policy back into the middle where it's a lot more likely to be successful.
I can't let that go completely.
Okay.
So facts are facts. I know you can do all things you want with statistics, but I think there's a normative issue here. It's not tax rates or tax policy. Bad tax policy has a negative impact on the economy and on job growth and on investment. But you can see there's no correlation between the economic performance in the high tax states and the no income tax states. I believe what Ralph put up there. What I think we're forgetting about is what that means. Those states have revenue structures that work for their states, that fund the services that people need and expect, but most importantly, it creates an air of predictability and stability that is critical for business decision-making and investment. It's our topsy-turvy. Every time we go down to Springfield, there's a new tax proposal, the gross receipts tax, this tax. That's what kills business. There is no stability. If the rates were higher and we had stability and we could fund government and we could get out of the pension debt crisis,
then investment would flow, because we do have enormous competitive advantages. So it's not the rate itself or the structure, it's the sensibility of our tax policy, the durability of it that matters.
Now we have a question from this side of the room.
The name is Jack Tucker, and the question is, how is it that the Civic Committee manages to grab all the headlines and the slightly saner voices that you can hear here get their information buried next to the obits?
That's not a loaded question, Senator.
Hello? I would say that probably 2 words: Chicago Tribune. We don't control the message because we don't control the media, and the Tribune has been a very effective amplifier for the Civic Committee. But we try to get the word out there. It's just a question of what has enamored the editorial boards.
People should start going to the State Journal Register's website and looking at their editorials.
Well, and the Civic Committee, I think, from my perspective, frankly, has a lot of solid contributions to make. They have a perspective on things, and they represent large employers in this state, and frankly, I want them engaged. I want their input. I'd rather hear on the front end what they perceive to be issues in the state that inform their opinions about where they're going to expand or if they're going to move. I'd rather know before they move than after. So the fact that we've got civic engagement from that group, I think, is a positive thing. It is, it's one perspective. It's not the entirety of the perspective, but I think it's an important one that, frankly, everybody in our job ought to take into consideration.
Okay, next question right here, then we'll get over to the other side.
Peter Bauger, question on pensions. Mr. Matire seemed to suggest that we could amortize our way out of at least a substantial part of the hard costs of pensions in the next 20 or 30 years. Do you agree with that the number should be cut down on how much we're paying back or paying into the pension funds? And will that substantially mitigate the pension problem that we're all so worried about?
Well, I think, Peter, one thing that's important to note, the number Ralph said to set the flat number payment at isn't lower. It's actually a little bit higher than where we are right now. So it is continuing to put significant money into that pension system. When we look at the pension issue we have right now, I still believe the bill that we passed was a reasonable and fair approach to a really, really difficult and expensive problem. Reading the tea leaves, I think there's a decent chance that Ralph's right. The Supreme Court does throw most of it out, maybe all of it out, which I think would be unfortunate. But if that occurs, we have an obligation here. So that's $139 billion in savings over the next 30 years that we lose. We've got to figure out a way to address that while still taking care of the here and now. So it's a math problem, and if the Supreme Court says there are certain pieces of the problem that you can't touch, then we're going to have to look really aggressively at the ones we can. Which is basically employee pay, and figure out a way to manipulate that number to be able to make this work. But, ideas like amortization or bonding it out or other opportunities like that, you're going to have to look at, because if the Supreme Court says you're paying it, there's no place else, there's no other recourse, there's nowhere else for us to go. We can try other legislation. But we're going to have to get our arms around this thing if they shut us down.
The amortization schedule we are living with today is incredibly artificial. and is the byproduct of the 1995 pension reform law, when the General Assembly, in which neither of us were a member, solved the problem, so they said, by creating a 50-year payment plan and bravely and courageously structurally underfunding the pension contributions for almost a decade to push the problem down the road. And the ramp, the acceleration of those payments hit at a horrible time for the state because the economy was not in a good place.
Again?
And we are dealing with the byproduct of that. So yes, I think a reamortization would make sense, but just a trick microphone, okay. It would cost us more money just by backloading the payments. And I don't believe the political will to do that and that alone exists. I think we do need to do what we can to contain the growth of the pension costs. I think the bill that we passed will clearly be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but there are other things that we can do in cooperation with the beneficiaries of the pension systems to structure a new deal that will be fair, in particular to retirees, but also to current employees to allow them to plan adequately for their retirement. And once we do that, then I think it makes perfect sense to go back and re-amortize that in a way that is much more economically honest and fair than the 1995 law.
Yeah, just to put some numbers on what Don just said, because the math is compelling here. So in 1995, the state's unfunded liability across all 5 systems was just over $17 billion, which sounds great today, but we were only 54% funded at that juncture. So we had one of the greatest unfunded liabilities as a percentage of what was owed to the systems in the entire country then. By law, that funding proposal that was passed in 1995 actually grew the unfunded liability from just north of $17 billion to almost $49 billion by 2008. That was the design of the law. That's how much it underfunded pensions. And then, of course, we all know what happened in 2008. We had the Great Recession, and on top of that, we had actuaries figure out that state workers were annoyingly living much longer than we wanted them to. And so they revised a number of assumptions, and that unfunded liability really ballooned overnight from $48 billion to north of $90 billion. But to be very clear, benefits aren't the driving cause of that, and nor are worker salaries. In fact, according to the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, COGFA, if you look at the contributing factors to the growth in that unfunded liability over time, combined wages, benefits, benefit cost, 7%. By far and away, almost 50% of the entire growth in the unfunded liability is just the state not making its actual contribution. It's an underpayment of the normal cost. So that's the driving factor, and I think Senator Murphy and Senator Harmon both correctly said our reamortization proposal, or the way we're looking at the numbers, would actually cost slightly more than what the state's putting in today, about $400 million more, so you'd have to ramp up to that. But it would grow the funded ratio, and it would grow it to healthy position by, in 30 years, 80% funded roughly instead of 100% funding, but doable. And it also wouldn't cost more than the current law, because you're paying a little bit more the first few years than what current law calls for. The magic of compounding interest over time means even though you're extending the payment period about 13 years longer, you end up paying not a lot less, but about roughly $2 billion less. So net, 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 it's a win for taxpayers, and it's constitutional, and it allows the systems to be funded, and it takes all the pressure sort of off the fiscal system by eliminating the growth in that payment. It flattens it out, so after inflation, it becomes a diminishing rather than a growing obligation of the state.
Now we have a question from this side of the room, and the founder of the Institute for Truth in Accounting, Sheila Weinberg. Sheila?
Thank you, David. Yeah, the SEC came in and said that that 95 law was misleading, that it did fund it by 90%. I'm curious about the Supreme Court ruling. If it does overturn the new pension reform law, I assume it's going to overturn that the benefits cannot be changed. Also, part of that law was that the contributions would be reduced. Will the Supreme Court take the whole law out and make us increase those contributions, or will it only take out that the benefits have to be reduced?
Well, Sheila, the quick answer is, without knowing what the Supreme Court will do, it has issued a permanent stay of the implementation of that bill. So under that stay, the state automatically reverts to the old pension funding law, right? And they cannot implement any of the changes in the act that has been declared unconstitutional at the lower court level until the Supreme Court renders its decision. So don't know what the final decision will be. It seems pretty clear from precedent that what they're going to do is rule the whole thing unconstitutional. That said, irrespective of what they do there, this budget year, you have to increase the amount of the pension contribution that the state is required to put in by not using the new schedule, but using the older schedule under that 1995 law that Senator Harmon discussed.
Okay, more questions? Here's one. Let me go here to the middle of the room.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I'm wondering about something that I've been reading about. In the public sector, the public agencies that employ public employees are, I guess from what I'm understanding, not making the contributions that in the private sector would have to be making. In other words, if IBM has employees, it pays a certain percentage into Social Security. Is there any mood or feeling that maybe it would be appropriate to have the public agencies set aside a percentage that would be comparable to the employer's participatory obligation to meet Social Security requirements? What's the feeling about that among your body in Springfield?
Well, the sorry truth is that all local governments that pay into the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, for instance, have to make their payments because we said so by law. We didn't say that to ourselves. And that's the nub of this problem, is that there is no statutory requirement that we make the payment that we couldn't change even if we enacted it. So it really is a question of discipline and honesty. And I think we've dealt with that over the last several years. We I think, have admitted to ourselves that we can't take pension holidays or pension staycations, as one of my colleagues called it, when we didn't fully fund the pension contribution for the year. But the truth is that even the payments that are required by law aren't actuarially sound.
Correct.
They aren't enough to both, they are more than enough to make the full normal cost contribution, the liability we incur in the current fiscal year. But they don't chip away adequately at the unfunded liability that is built up over not years, not tens of years, but the first pension warning, the first report we've seen that the pension systems were about to collapse came from 1917. So we've been whistling past the graveyard successfully for a while, but we can't ignore this. We cannot continue. We can't go back to an era of funding government by not making our pension payments.
Senator Murphy?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. You know, the payment we make every year, the $6 billion payment we're making this year, less than half of that is that payment that you're describing. The rest of it is trying to catch up with the whole. And, you know, that there's no question. There's been a much better effort at trying to play catch-up over the last few years. But it's still a deep hole, which is why we tried to do the reform to see if we could make this something that was a little bit more manageable and a little easier to catch up to, and a little more, frankly, long-term sustainable.
Here's our next question. You say you're...
Hi, I'm Rochelle Gordon. My question is directed to Senator Murphy. You talked about a grand bargain, and I'm just wondering what elements you see as part of a grand bargain, and specifically what elements would be included that are not related to tax policy specifically.
Well, I think the thought process with re-looking at what we do is you know, if we want to be a more pro-growth state, if we want to be a top 5 job growth state where the people here have a maximum opportunity to get the best job they can get, and for our narrow purposes today, can become taxpayers at a higher rate, we need to look at our cost of doing business for job creators in the state. What can we do that doesn't relate to the budget to bring the cost of doing business down in Illinois? I mean, one of the advantages we have is our energy costs, frankly, are better than a lot of our neighbors. That's one in our plus column. We've got, you know, litigation and work comp expenses that are higher than our neighbors. There are some reasons for that aren't necessarily all driven by policy, but are there ways for us to drive some savings there? You know, what else can we do to make this a more attractive destination? I think a lot of it has to do with providing the predictability and stability and showing people who might choose to invest in Illinois, hey, it's safe to come and take advantage of all of the great things we have here because we've got our house in order. I think there's a lot of value in that. I think Don's right about that. But in the process, you know, if we can bring that overall cost of doing business down, and taxes are just one piece of that, healthcare costs are another one. If we can bring those costs of doing business down in the context of dealing with our fiscal crisis, I think we can put ourselves on a long-term trajectory of being a more attractive state for people to be willing to invest in and move to, and most importantly, put the people we all represent to work in the best job they can get.
Just one comment on that. One of the big things we hear about all the time is that it's much more expensive for workers' compensation insurance here in Illinois than it is in our neighboring states, and that's a big impediment to business development here. Workers' compensation costs are derivative of the wages that are paid, and the wages paid in Illinois are materially higher than in our neighboring states. I don't think we want to make that trade. So I think there are things we can do to make Illinois much more business friendly that we can all agree on, but we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. The knee-jerk nominal comparisons don't always make sense. We want to be a high-wage state. We want people living in Illinois to make a better living.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention, I think we need to look a little bit at unemployment benefits as well as a cost of doing business driver, which is somewhat part and parcel of the point Don just made. I mean, part of the reason that our unemployment costs are higher to employers here is because the salary is higher. I mean, you have to recognize that reality when you're looking at these things, but it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities to address them and maybe wring some more savings out as part of a new story to tell.
And really quickly to pile on that. So both senators are exactly right that the main factor from a tax policy standpoint that businesses consider is predictability. So the main concern they have about Illinois is its fiscal house is not in order and they do not know what's going to happen, and hence they can't modify their pricing structure to account for what their anticipated tax burden is going to be on a rational basis. That's a huge problem. And I just want to point out that sometimes we actually agree with Senator Murphy. I want to point that out. So there are areas where the state of Illinois is not business friendly, and that's very clear. And one of those areas is in our permitting process. And CTBA serves on a task force pulled together by the Illinois Farm Bureau that has looked at sort of the vision for the future of the Illinois economy generally and the ag business specifically. And one thing that could really be cleaned up to really promote strong business growth is our permitting process. To get the same sort of permit in Illinois, and I'll just pull one example, a permit to put together an energy facility takes 18 to 24 months before you could put shovel in earth. Iowa, Indiana, Wisconsin, 4 months or less. That's a significant differential. And that is something that is not exactly kind
And it doesn't cost us anything.
It doesn't cost us anything.
I mean, that's not right. And
So
no,
it's
that's
the-
a great point.
So it's
Yeah.
the kind of thing we really do need to look at. And long term, though, I said that taxes don't have that statistically meaningful correlation to your economic growth, and they don't. But two things do that are policy decisions: investments in education and investments in infrastructure. And why we should have some hope is Governor Rauner has laid on the table his recognition of the evidence that investment comprehensively in education, preschool, K-12, and higher ed, is something that grows your economy and creates the numerate literate workforce that's competitive in a modern economy. So hopefully that'll be part of the discussion going forward.
Rob, let me pick up on that theme for a second. You had argued, and CTBA has argued, that we need to reform, we need to change Illinois' tax structure.
Yeah.
Let me ask the two senators about this in a historic context. In the 1980s, a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, worked with Tip O'Neill and then chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, for an historic revamp of the federal tax code, massive rewrite of the tax code at the federal level. An analogy here, we have a Republican governor and we have a General Assembly controlled by the other party. Do you think there is an opportunity? What would you put the odds, gentlemen, of there being a kind of reforming of Illinois' tax policy in a partnership with a Republican governor, Republican executive branch leader, and a Democratic General Assembly? What are the chances we will see significant tax policy change?
Well, I think again, I think the fact that you've got a new governor, ran as a change agent, ran as somebody who would come down and question everything, is going to throw everything into question. And I really think that's helpful. And like your example, we have a very outgoing and gregarious Speaker of the House who I am sure is going to want to reach out to the new governor in a similar way. I don't know if they're going to have beer summits like Reagan and Tip did, but I am actually somewhat optimistic that this dynamic provides a really good opportunity for big things to happen, and a reassessment of our entire tax structure, and maybe something new that comes out of this, I think has the potential to occur.
If Murphy and I can contain our worst impulses, I actually think that there's much more likelihood of a grand bargain than I think is commonly believed right now. All the ingredients are on the table. Governor Rauner has called for a tax on services. That's something the Senate Democrats advocated for in a limited scale several years ago. The Speaker of the House was instrumental in putting on the ballot a referendum on a millionaire's tax for education. I'm going to continue to push for the fair tax. All these ingredients add up to something that makes sense, some re-envisioning of what we do. But I would say that the role of Tip O'Neill will more likely be played by John Cullerton.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are nearing the end of our allotted time here, but before we conclude this session, we want to first ask everyone to join us in a warm round of applause for two senators who have joined us here today. Senator Don Harmon, Senator Matt Murphy. And gentlemen, we think you have your work cut out for you, and we thank you for spending time and for sharing your insights with us today on these very difficult challenges. And the Union League Club of Chicago and the Public Affairs Committee would like to thank Ralph Matire and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Ralph, thank you. And we always have some lovely parting gifts for our participants. We're not going to give Ralph anything because he's depressing.
But never get the gift.
That's right. However, we do have, and by the way, this is well below the threshold for any kind of gift reportable item. A lovely Union League Club coffee mug for Senator Murphy. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like the program that you've experienced here today, I invite you on your way out of the room to pick up some information about the Union League Club of Chicago and membership in this wonderful institution. We do this kind of programming all the time on tax and budget policy, on health policy, on education policy, transportation policy, and all kinds of other wonderful programs to learn about what's going on at the state and the federal and the municipal level. And I think that the value of what Ralph and CTBA do, whether or not one might quibble with some of the statistical methods or some of the ways in which the data are presented, the fact is that Ralph is a very sober analyst, and he's given us all a lot to think about. And I think that the value of programs like the one we've had this morning is not to tell us what to think, but to tell us what is important to think about. So in that context, we thank you for coming. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we hope you enjoy more programs here at the Union League Club of Chicago, and keep going to the CTBA website for all of the most depressing analysis of the day. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're adjourned.